I decided to go ahead and do a live today. Why not? Um, I'm going to discuss some things and relate it to some of the work I've done, almost like I did in my last stream that I did for the weekend, but this will be a little different because I have some other things to discuss insofar as the real life perils that we face and what it means for us in particular, for Westerners, for Americans. Hey, into the fray. Great to see you and Brogan and Efi and Boxer Mom. You're all very welcome here. I'm glad you all came in. So, what I'm going to be discussing is let me turn my ringer off here. What I'm going to be discussing, hey, Welder Princess and NWO Nemesis, great to see you. What I'm going to be discussing today is similar to my last stream, but this is going to continue with some other information. Now, I'm going to start it by illustrating how hybrid warfare works and why and what it entails, because a lot of people, I don't think, really understand the gravity of it and why and how it works or how it was even made possible. So I'm going to go over in great detail all the aspects of hybrid warfare and how it came to be that we have gotten into the situation that we're in. And we are absolutely 100% in this situation. And all the research that's been done on this channel, for the works created on this channel, all have to do with the information that I've uncovered, I've analyzed, and I've pieced together. Now, what is so important about this is that this is all information that 100% affects everybody who lives here, regardless of what they think or believe. It doesn't matter because the facts remain, and people can ignore the facts if they so choose to, or they can smarten up, wise up, and come to grips with it, because this is absolutely 100% reality. So here's the deal. In all the stories and all the video map battle docu-series that I created for this channel, I always show how these items work insofar as not just the armies involved and how they ended up here, how they were able to get in all their equipment, items like Club Ks, which are caliber cruise missiles or their Chinese equivalent, because the Chinese make those too. They build them on their own. They make their own. They certainly have plenty of them in here. I talk about how they got here, both the Russian and Chinese models of the Club Ks and what they were capable of. In fact, years ago on this channel, and it's been about 3 years, I went over the Club K and its specifications, what it's capable of, and what it would look like if you moved a whole bunch of Club K systems. We're talking maybe like even 10 to 15,000 systems in this country would cause immense damage, because each container carries 4 cruise missiles a piece. So if you have 10,000 systems, that's 40,000 cruise missiles. 40,000, because we're going off of 4 per container. Simple math, right? So if you had 15,000, you would have 60,000 missiles. Again, multiplying by a factor of 4. So if you can imagine this for a second, all these Club Ks that were imported through the Chi-Com-owned ports in North America, especially even in our own country, because they own the biggest West Coast port, which is Long Beach Port. They also own the port of LA, which is adjacent to that. They own the port of Houston, Miami, and Seattle, among other ports. The Chi-Coms have. And they've owned it through their regime through a front company called Costco, not to be confused with the stores, but there's a company called Costco which runs these ports. Now, they have owned the ports for a few decades now, which has given them plenty of time. If you add up all the logistics and the vehicles and the units that would have been imported, you would have in 20 years what would equate to about 20 Desert Shield buildups. If you all can remember back in the 90s, early 90s, 1990, when Desert Shield was in effect, there were some roughly 500,000 Western troops and their equipment that had been moved into the Middle East. Of course, you had your Middle Eastern allies that were already in the area, which added manpower to that coalition as well. But we're just talking about just the Western forces ended up moving into Saudi and other adjacent areas, and Desert Shield comprised 500,000 troops and their different respective units with all their vehicles, their full complement of vehicles, weapons, logistics, everything, fuel, all of it. So in 20 years' time, if you had about 20 Desert Shields, you can imagine how many foreign troops are in this country by now. And I'm sure they're on a regular rotational basis, like I depicted in my story, in my audiobook and other stories, how they rotate like it's a regular deployment. And that's something that's not only feasible, it's something that would be really happening because you have this long-term plan to set up your enemy for invasion, and therefore you would have to rotate troops in and out of country, and you would have them disguised as, like students, like agriculture students, like my 1 battalion's men were here under student visas. It could be anything, business people, illegals, border jumpers, whatever. It can be anything, tourists, any of that. They get in here, they stay on their CCP-owned properties because China is the biggest property owner in this entire land. Yes, they own more property than BlackRock, Vanguard, Gates, whoever. They own more property than all of them. So you would have all these different CCP regime properties, and that had been a big deal when they got these, what do they call them, solar farms there out in the southwestern states, especially adjacent to military bases, air bases. Well, if you could imagine, you have something like a Chi-Com air defense unit parked right outside of a air base, an American Air Force base. You can imagine the results of something like that. It would be catastrophic, right? Well, it's not just air defense units. It would be entire group armies with all their subordinate units, their subunits, thus broken up into their subordinate battalions belonging to each subunit, and they would all be based on different CCP regime properties that were very, very close to their assigned objectives during an invasion, meaning that just like depicted in my audiobook and also in my map battles, all those different battalion-sized units, I showed the parent unit icon, but then the actual units themselves were all broken up into their battalions, their respective battalions that comprised the parent unit. I would always put the parent unit in parentheses so people can see what the different battalions on the map belong to, in accordance with their parent unit that they comprised, because these different battalions comprised the larger parent units, which were all subordinate subunits of the larger group army. So you'd have from big to small in terms of unit sizes. If you're looking at a Chinese force and it was a PLA force, it would go group army as the biggest. Then you would have it broken down into its subordinate divisions or brigades or regiments or even independent battalions, because you might have like a headquarters battalion that's called an independent battalion, meaning it doesn't have a parent unit, but it's just the battalion containing the administrative forces within that group army. Like the independent headquarters battalion would be the leadership over the entire group army and all their subordinate, administrative elements, and you might have some cooks and mechanics and elements like that, maybe engineers, because you would have people that would be well versed in construction for constructing their combat outposts or their forward operation base, whatever it would be. And it would of course originate on the CCP regime properties. That would be where your invasion would start. I also showed how some of them would be logistical centers and logistical hubs, whereby the Trojan shock units would have these strategically purchased, bought and paid for CCP regime properties right off of major highways that would be key invasion routes inland for their forces coming in from Mexico and Canada, or even beach landing. You would have your beach landing forces. They wouldn't, of course, be anywhere near as big as the forces crossing both borders, because remember, the Chi-Coms have forces in Canada. That's a proven fact. They've been caught on video at their Salt Spring Island base doing PT marches, road marches, like what I used to do in the Army. They've been caught in uniform doing PT road marches. And most of the people that seen it didn't even understand the ramifications of what the hell they were even seeing. They didn't understand that's a foreign military force in your country. It's like the guy that filmed it, that I saw the film of it, he was like, this guy in his truck, he's like, he didn't even know what it was. He didn't understand what he was even seeing. He didn't get the ramifications of how serious that was. But I sure did when I seen it. Not only that, but there's been all kinds of confirmed sightings of Chinese PLAAF aircraft flying over London, Ontario, because they have an air base near there. Canada is a large, vast nation. Now, if you understand that there's known, well-established, well-known Chi-Com air activity up there, and also ground activity with their troops, then it's easy to know that they have massive forces up there. Now, I had a subscriber. Her name is Blue Eyes. She goes by Blue Eyes on here. Now, she had sent me a video from a Mexican man who has his own channel who did a guided tour on a road that was built by Chi-Com paramilitary national construction forces. It was a road in Mexico that they built specifically for their future invasion. It was a road that was to connect to some kind of border area that they could drive all their armored vehicles up at the time of the invasion from wherever their staging areas and bases were within Mexico, where they could drive up the road and get to their jumping off points for the future invasion. There's also even an island. See, this guy only saw a certain percentage of it personally. He only knew of a percentage of it. Of course, you would have many, many more such installations. This guy showed an island where it was well known that the Chinese, the Russians, the Pakistanis, the Iranians all had a base on this island. It was an island that sat in that gulf between the Baja Peninsula and the mainland of Mexico, the most of the mainland. Now there's a gulf there. I think it's like the Gulf of California, I believe. Well, that was where the island was. That was a base for all these foreign forces. Now, again, you've got Chi-Com activity all over the world. They have the biggest paramilitary forces in the entire world, and they also have the largest military. When you take their active duty and their reserves and combine them, you get almost 10 million men for their military, because you have 5 million reserves and you have 4 million active duty from the different branches. And you combine all that together, that's almost 10 million. That's 9 million something. So then you combine that with their 20 million man paramilitary forces, which are all combat trained and armed. You have almost 30 million men under arms already. That's literally tens of millions of men under arms, plural, because it's over 10 million. It's 29 million. It's nearly 30 million men under arms between both their paramilitary forces, which means it's a parallel military structure. Like, they have two different militaries, and their paramilitary has different branches, like the PAP, like the National Militia Forces, the Marine Militia Forces, and the National Construction Corps, which are your paramilitary engineers, your civil and combat engineers. And then you also have your PLA Strategic Reserve, not to be confused with the regular PLA reserves of their active duty military. That comes under their military command in a time of war, and it's strictly for home defense uses only. So it's sort of like their national militia and such. But China has these enormous forces already. Now, demographically, the demographics of China are such that military-aged men, they have a military-aged male population of 350 million between the ages of 18 and 35. That's just the men. Of course, they have a roughly comparable amount of women in that age bracket. So 350 million men. That's not counting the other 300 and about 20 million women in that same age bracket, which it's about 650 or so odd million people. But I looked at the male age group, which is 350 million in that age bracket. If you were to add the ages of 40 to 50, that would be another roughly 200 million. So China has these demographics that afford them the ability to if they, because they have 40%, literally 40% of the entire world's industry, their industrial base, it's 40% of the whole world's industrial base. They're the most industrialized and the most technologically advanced nation on Earth now. You have the ability for them to actually arm and equip such an army. It would take time. But they could do it. There's no other nation on Earth that could do what China can do. And not only that, but I came across some information that, during China and Russia, they're thick as thieves. They trade. They do military operations and drills together. They did drills like Zapad and Vostok, and they did joint naval patrols, not just in the Sea of Japan, but also on the coasts of North America. But here's the thing. When it came to Chinese and Russian trade, did you know that the first train of the year going from China into Russia has brought along Chinese engineering forces and construction workers, along with brand spanking new manufacturing equipment for the purposes of building Russia additional factories to add to their military industrial complex? Yes. One of the people, I believe he was a Russian panel member on, I believe him. He had no reason to lie about this. He was a Russian panel member, I believe, on Gonzalo Lira's channel, who mentioned this. Russia can manufacture well in excess. I mean, Russia already has the second biggest industrial capacity for war manufacturing after China. They're the second biggest after China, but China, being the good ally they are, the good, senior partner in that relationship, had sent Russia some additional factories that they're going to build for them for the purposes of adding to Russia's already sizable ability to manufacture weapons, including artillery shells and rockets and such. Russia already had a large manufacturing base. Their military industrial complex is already larger than ours, but then China is adding to it. They're doing for Russia essentially what they've already done for Pakistan. They have revamped the entire Pakistani military industrial complex. China has. Now China is building factories for Pakistan. They've already done so, but they're continually doing this, and they've already, along with Pakistan, help them to develop even more capable aircraft for their air force than they already had, like the brand new JF-17 fighter, which is a Chinese and Pakistani fighter. China allows Pakistan to build them by license in the Chinese-built factories that are in Pakistan. Now, this is like a 4.5 generation fighter aircraft. It's considered a multi-role / air superiority fighter jet. It's a very high-tech, brand spanking new fighter system, but it's multi-role. It's capable of ground attack operations and such also, because of course you can arm basically every type of fighter jet with ground attack munitions if you want to, but normally fighters are strictly for air superiority, which means, downing other aircraft. And this JF-17 is an extremely capable fighter jet. In fact, I put a photo of two Chinese ones. You can tell by the white marking. They have the roundel. It's called a roundel, which is the insignia of each air force that is on the aircraft. Well, there's a roundel for the Chinese PLAAF on the two JF-17 fighter jets I put up in my Chi-Com fighter post I made, so you can see them. They're the fourth, I put 5 different pictures up. I couldn't even fit all the different types of fighter jets China has, but so I just put up the the five main ones. They have fourth generation fighters, which are, any Air Force that's comprised of fourth, 4.5, and fifth generation fighter jets is a highly capable, elite type of a fighting force when it comes to air combat. So China has fourth generation fighter jets like the J-10, the J-11, and then, of course, they have 4.5 generation aircraft like the J-16, which its airframe of the J-16, it might look similar to the J-11, but it's actually a completely different aircraft. It has a less elongated airframe. It's like a shortened version in terms of the airframe of what the J-11 fighter is, and it has even more capable radars and firing control systems in it, and it's got electronic warfare capabilities built into it with the KG-600s and all kinds of things. It's basically like a brand new design, even though it was sort of like a J-11 that's been improved upon, but it's been shortened and it's had a lot of upgrades to it. And the J-11 was already a highly capable fighter jet to begin with. So now the J-16, this brand new design, this is like a 4.5 generation fighter. And then, of course, you have, similar to what they call the Eurofighter Typhoon and the French Rafale aircraft, those are also considered 4.5 generation. They're both highly capable planes, or like the Saab Gripen, which is Sweden's new fighter jet. They're called 4.5 generation fighter aircraft due to the technological advancement and the upgrades to these aircraft and the capabilities that they possess in aerial combat. So, and also multi-role, because they can also transition as, quite effective ground attack platforms as well. But, all that aside, I was getting sidetracked. Now, they also have the JF-17, and that is what Pakistan is now building by license, which greatly adds air-to-air combat capabilities to their Air Force. See, before, Pakistan used to buy a lot of military equipment from us, but now that China has revamped their war industries, they're getting more capable Chinese designs that are even cheaper and even more effective than what we've basically sold them in the past. Pakistan used to operate the F-16 fighter jet, but they still have them. But now they're getting even better aircraft like the JF-17. The Chinese also have a fifth generation aircraft. Like, they have two different stealth fighter designs, one for their Air Force and one for their Navy. They have the J-31, which is their naval stealth aircraft. It resembles somewhat of an F-22, but that's been miniaturized. And then they have of course, their indigenously designed J-20, which is for their Air Force. And they have their stealth bomber called the H-20 stealth bomber. So China has these immense capabilities. They have the biggest combat air fleet on the face of the earth. Not overall Air Force, not just yet, but they have more combat planes, giving them the biggest capability to wage air wars than any other nation on earth. So Russia has the second biggest combat air fleet, and that's due in part to the large number of Cold War heavy strategic bombers that have been kept into long-term storage and well-maintained, for their aerial reserves. So you got China with this freakishly enormous combat air fleet, and they have reserve aircraft too, a lot of them. Not just their main, their main combat fleet. They have reserve aircraft like Q-5 ground attack planes. They've got additional J-10s that are in storage. They've got a lot of stuff. I mean, China's beefed up. I'm telling you, they are way beefed up. And now they're helping Russia, like what they did for Pakistan, to build additional factories just to add just that much more capabilities to Russian arms manufacturing. So I guess it's good to have a friend like China in your neighborhood who can, stop by and hook you up, and that's basically what they're doing for Russia right now, according to this guest on Gonzalo Lira's last panel. And I believe him. He has no reason to lie about that, and it makes perfect sense because China and Russia are, again, they're thick as thieves. So for China to do what they did for Pakistan, but for Russia makes complete sense, because they're both close allies as well, and they would be helping each other in any ways they could. And China, the most industrialized nation on the face of the earth, bar none. Nobody's even close to that because they have 40% of the entire world's industrial base, and out of that, the biggest military industrial complex to boot. They also make the most electronic components in the world, chips and otherwise. They are the most technologically advanced nation on the face of the earth, and nobody can threaten them. There's nothing we could do to them unless we tried sabotage with ground-based, human sabotage. That would be the only way that we could do something to China without causing an outright war. But, somebody mentioned something about the rods of God. Well, space isn't real, so if they had weapons like that, which I believe they do, but they would only carry one or two rods, because you have to understand these satellites are held up by high altitude balloons. There is no such thing as outer space. So the satellites being held up by high altitude balloons, you could only carry a few of those things. And if you used one of those, China would know. They would know about that, and they would retaliate swiftly and harshly, very, very much so, because they too have quote unquote so-called space-based weapons. Even though space isn't real, they too have high altitude satellites that are held up also that carry directed energy weapons and other such means of retaliation. And if anybody fired anything upon them, it would basically trigger an outright world war. So I don't believe that anybody's done anything to them, nor could they. It's quite impossible. And we know from the word that China, the kings of the East, the Red Dragon, the great Red Dragon, who comes to the Battle of Armageddon, they're with us until the end of time. We're stuck with them until Yeshua comes back and defeats them, because only he can defeat China. Nobody can make war against a nation that's that powerful, that's that massive. It's just impossible. They have the most advanced supercomputers. Even the Pentagon's own supercomputer itself, speaking of supercomputers, had predicted us losing every last single solitary war simulation to China for now the past 6 years. I used to say 5 years when I would bring this up, but now it's the past 6 years because we're in 2023 now. So it's well established and well understood that China would crush us in a war. And not just China, but also in the NATO war drills, we lose to Russia. We do. We lose to Russia. And it exposed the weaknesses of Britain and France, who run out of artillery howitzer shells in a week and a day. 8 days is all it takes. 8 whole days. And basically they're out of there. For us, what we manufacture in a year's time gets expended in a week, basically, or not a week, 10 days. It takes 10 days for us to expend the artillery shells we produce annually. So now that we've given these immense stockpiles of both 105 millimeter and 155 shells to Ukraine, you have to understand, we had a capable artillery arm, but it was nowhere even close to being as big as China's or Russia's, who are both, for all intents and purposes, about equal in the number of pieces they have. Now, China wanted to, produce new artillery units. They have immense artillery howitzers in reserve that are in long-term storage that they could bring out and do a once-over refurb and equip brand new units with, or they could just build brand new howitzers because they have this gigantic military-industrial complex that they can basically build whatever they want. And in great numbers, I've gone over the amounts of tanks they can produce and the amounts of jets that are in the fighter jet category or ground attack jet category, which they can produce immense amounts of. They can produce about 400 jets that are either fighter or ground attack aircraft annually. That's their capacity. We, on the other hand, can only manufacture up to 80. And there's no way we could increase that because we don't have that type of industry anymore. It's all been dismantled. It's all gone. And to bring it back online would take an immense amount of time, an immense amount of expertise, and a large workforce, and the resources. Now, you have to understand, China is the world's biggest aluminum producer, which affords them the ability to build such an immense amount of aircraft in a year, 400. That's their capacity. Their tanks, they can produce 750 modern main battle tanks a year. Russia can produce 250. So they can only produce 1/3 what China can produce in terms of battle tanks. Now, when we're talking about armor personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles, for every tank you can build the equivalent of about 3 or so armor personnel carriers or infantry fighting vehicles. That would cost about the same amount of resources and metals and things like that to produce. So if China can produce 750 main battle tanks a year, now these are modern tanks with modern equipment in them, modern communications, combat data links, countermeasures like their equivalent of the trophy system that can basically shoot down incoming anti-tank weapons like missiles and such. They have IR scrambling devices in their tanks. They have all kinds of things. They've got brand spanking new fire control systems and guidance systems insofar as like gun stabilizing systems and IR imaging and all kinds of things. These tanks are not the old school World War II tanks or early Cold War tanks. That's the point I'm getting at. That's so to be able to produce 750 of these brand new types of battle tanks, that is an immense quantity of tanks to be able to produce annually. Because if we were talking old tanks, they would be able to produce thousands of older tanks that didn't have all these modern amenities, I'll call them, on board the tanks. They could produce, for every modern tank they could produce hundreds of older tanks. But since they're building these new tanks with brand new technology in them, and the armor is top notch because they're also the world's biggest tungsten producer, and they can put a certain percentage of the tungsten within their rolled homogeneous steel armor to make that armor immensely potent against any type of weapons, any type of anti-tank weapons. So they have basically tungsten, when it's bound right, when you use the right binding agent in it, it's the hardest metal known to man, aside from its close rival, which is depleted uranium. Tungsten is an extremely hard metal, which is why it is used now in anti-materiel ammunition. I'm talking bullets. It's also used in sabot rounds, which are tank rounds that are made to kill other tanks. Tungsten is a very potent, very strong metal, and China is the world's single biggest producer of tungsten by a humongous gap, just like they are with steel production. All of these metals translate to military production, and they already have these enormous, gigantic factory complexes that have been added to what they've already had. They've already been a big industrial power, but they couldn't, before they had all these new factories come online, they couldn't outproduce the USSR during the Cold War, but they could produce a lot, but they couldn't outproduce the USSR. Nobody really could. We couldn't either. We didn't produce as much as they did. But when China, at the end of the Cold War in the late 90s, started building all these additional factories, we're talking a few hundred or more, and they all came online by the mid-2010s, you started to see China leap ahead in terms of war production, and now they have the world's single biggest military-industrial complex for the past 6 years. And that was also when the Pentagon supercomputers started to predict us losing to them. And, we're talking about industrial warfare, like that Duran channel called it. I've never called it that. I just simply talked about the numbers and stats and compared them. But if you want to have a term for it, I guess industrial warfare fits. There's nothing we can do in a full-on war to be able to compete with the sheer industrial might that is China. But also Russia, because Russia has the second biggest, even before China went in there this year to help them build new factories, Russia was fully capable of producing an immense quantity of ammunition, of vehicles, of whatever they needed, of missiles, all kinds of things. So now that China is helping them to revamp their industries and build even more factories than Russia already had to begin with, Russia's output will grow to even larger amounts. Now, you have to remember, Russia from the Soviet days, when they were producing literally up to 1 billion artillery shells of different calibers, of different sizes, Russia has 1 billion shells. They have these enormous stockpiles. And China has even more, but Russia has up to 1 billion shells. So at the rate they're expending shells, that's why they can do massed artillery assaults, because they're not worried about running out. And even though the amount of shells they produce might not equal the amount they're firing per day, it still doesn't matter when you have enough artillery shells already to do the same thing for almost 40 years. It's like 37, 38 years, depending on if it's 20,000 a day, 30,000 a day, 40 or 50,000 a day. It doesn't, it might fluctuate depending on like what type of assaults they're doing or things like that. And China has even more shells than Russia. China has the just a gargantuan stockpile as well, but then now they have all these additional industries to where they're cranking out ammunition like it's nobody's business. For the past 5 years, or 6 years now, I should say, they've been ramping up production of everything because all their additional factories have come online. And now China is growing by enormous stretches in terms of just the sheer number of vehicles and equipment and ammunition they already possess. Now, Russia being the second biggest now, they're coming back because now they're going to add to the size of their military just based, and I'm talking about their active duty military. Russia already had big reserves. They had 2 million reserves, but their active duty military was only 1.2 million. But now they're going to add a corps to it, and I believe several divisions of additional troops. So, they're talking about growing their forces, gradually expanding to about 300,000 additional active duty service personnel. So Russia had 300,000 paramilitary forces, which they called the National Guard, used to be called their internal troops, and you can lump PMC Wagner in there because Wagner's not really a PMC. It is only in name a PMC, but really it reports to the Kremlin. It's basically a subsidiary of the paramilitary of Russia that does all the dirty work for the Kremlin. They do wet works and other, dirty operations, and they have an air of plausible deniability because they can always just claim they're a PMC, even though they're, basically under contract by the Kremlin. They've been used to go overseas to areas where Russia had established spheres of influence to go train their military forces. Like they've used some of them to go and train the forces in the Central African Republic. And, Russia's talking about building a naval base in the Red Sea in Sudan. And they have already got a footprint now in Mali, the country called Mali. So Russia, you see, and also Libya too. Russia is very active in Northern Africa. And you have China, who's extremely highly active in sub-Saharan Africa, which is like your rainforest and south of that area of Africa. China has a naval base in Djibouti. They've got a naval base in Cambodia called Reem. They've got bases in Mexico, like I just talked about a moment ago, also in Canada. And Russia has a base in Cuba. It's a SIGINT base. It's a signals intelligence base. And, there's also Chinese activity in Cuba as well. I would assume they have a base there, easily. And Russians have started to become active in Nicaragua again. So you have basically all the things I've been telling everybody for a very long time already in action. You're watching it happening. It's been happening really, but you're starting to see more and more of it. And others are starting to finally begin talking about some of these things that I've already been talking about for a long time. So relating it to my stories, this is what happened in the stories, and also even in the map documentaries of the battle maps that go with the stories, the typed and audiobook stories. You had this occurring. You had the Trojan shock troops basically have their phone chains activated by a simple one-word text message that was their signal to muster. It was their muster signal. They thereby all rushed back to their CCP bases, which are their CCP properties, because you have to understand this. China has what is called the Civil-Military Fusion policy, to where any and all types of properties, transportation, anything they need can be used as a military use. It can serve as a dual civilian and military use. That means everything on the Belt and Road, all the projects, ports, roads, everything, all of that serves as a military use whenever the CCP deems it ready to be used for such purpose. So you have to understand, all these CCP properties bought strategically adjacent to installations, cities, everything. Those are for the future invasion. There are absolutely 100% without a doubt Trojan shock armies. They hate when I talk about this, and this video will probably be shadow banned, but I don't give a damn. I'm going to keep talking about it because this is that important. Just like my tone in the last video was serious, my tone in this video is very serious because this is serious. This is what all the work on this channel is for. I don't have anything against the people of Russia or the people of China, but what I'm talking about is that they have their own elites that have their own plans. They're going to shaft the Western elites, and they're going to basically, who they see as their rivals, even though they've done business with them, they're going to basically be like two rival mafia syndicates that might do business but also have wars with each other. You've ever heard of that? Mafias that go to war against each other? Well, it's the same concept but on a much more massive scale. Now, Russia and China, their elites are within their regimes themselves because the regimes control the central bank, which means they therefore control the issuance of the currencies, which means if they control the issuance of the currencies, then they themselves are the elites. It's not, see, in the West, it's the opposite. In the West, the central banks own the regimes because they're the ones that lend money to the regimes, whereas in the East, the regimes aren't lent money. They just take it. You know, you see that in Russia with the bank laws, where Russia is, the central bank of Russia is obligated by law to give the regime of Russia half of all their annual profits every year. You would never see that in the West. You would never, ever see anything like that in the West. No, because it's always loaned in the West, because it's about debt slavery in the West. In the East, the regimes control their banks. China, the CCP, controls their central bank too. And same with India. The Reserve Bank of India is controlled by the regime in India. Of course, the same thing in Iran, the same thing in Pakistan, and the same thing in North Korea. The regimes all control their central banks there, you know. So it used to be like that in Iraq too, but then when we knocked off Saddam, guess what came? Everywhere America went, so did the American financial system, where a central bank was established that would control the regime and lend money to the regime, similar to what's been done in the West. So you have these two competing systems against each other, but only one can win, and we know who that is, because there will be a final showdown called World War III, where you have the East against the West, and that's a real thing, and the East is going to come out on top. The East wins because there's nothing in this world. There's nothing worldly. There's no worldly power that can compete with China. It will literally take God, Yeshua Messiah, smiting the kings of the East and their massive, ginormous armies at Armageddon. It's literally going to take Yeshua Messiah to destroy China. There's no worldly, earthly power that can compete with China, the kings of the East, the Red Dragon. There's nobody that can compete with them. They're the most powerful worldly force when it comes to this physical world. They're the most powerful nation in all of world history that the world will have ever seen. And Russia, the number 2 power. But China and Russia are thick as thieves. You know, China is helping Russia to expand their military-industrial complex, which is, it's interesting, you know. I mean, finding that out, I was like, oh, wow. You know, I mean, Russia already had a big war industry, but now you got China going in there and doing like what they did for Pakistan. Now they're going to help Russia build even newer factories, even more factories with brand new equipment to help them with their output, to make their output even bigger than it already even was, and it was already pretty sizable, but now it's going to be even more. Now, whenever these several new factories come online, I guess that'll be done within several months to maybe a year's time. I guess it depends on the size of the factory. All I know is that Chinese construction crews and engineers and brand new machinery were brought into Russia on the first train into Russia between the two countries because they share a common border and they trade with one another. But for the first train to be carrying all that stuff to help Russia's war industry, that was quite an interesting thing to find out. Now, you have all these foreign bases around the world, and like I said before, China and Russia are very austere-minded people. They're very austere and frugal. You can call them cheap, whatever. But they don't want to expend anything if they know they don't have to. So they put their bases in the most strategic places. They don't just have willy-nilly a bunch of different scattered random bases. No, they consolidate their overseas installations to places where it makes the most sense to put them. And China has it done in such a way to where their Belt and Road creates installations that can be used literally anywhere where they feel like using it. Now, again, that plays directly into what I was just saying a bit earlier, where I was going into the details in the story. Their phone chains were activated insofar as the foreign troops. They all reported to their local CCP regime property where they lived and worked, as far as being overseas deployed troops that were, in civilian clothing. They all mustered. They got the muster signal. They all went back. They mustered. They got in their uniforms and armor and gear and equipment. They got their vehicles out of barns or underground parking areas that were built on some of these properties or wherever they had them hidden, in old warehouses, factories. Whole battalions were hidden away like that, and or had their vehicles covered up by tarps or all kinds of different measures of disguising these vehicles. So they went and they mustered. They got in their formations. They got briefed on their upcoming role in the invasion, just like I portrayed it in my audiobook and stories, my written stories. And also on the battle maps themselves, where all these different battalions just pop up on the map and they start going for different objectives. That's exactly how it would happen. What would occur then, after they got their muster signal and went back to their installations, is you'd have Chinese and Russian anti-satellite weapons knocking all our eyes and ears out of the sky. Any satellites we had in the sky would be gone. All of them. And believe me, between Russia and China, they have tens of thousands of anti-satellite missiles. So Russia and China have both already threatened Starlink that they would knock all 5,000 of their satellites out of the sky. And they definitely have the ability to do so. They have the missiles to do so, but they threatened, they made a threat like that. Now, in a real war against us, they would knock down all our military satellites and all our civilian satellites with it. We would be deaf, dumb, and blind. We would be unable to organize, unable to coordinate, unless it's within your local area, and you can do it on foot or on an all-terrain vehicle. You're not really going to be able to use things like civilian vehicles because all those things are going to get annihilated if they're seen on the roads, just like I showed in my stories. So what would happen then is the anti-satellite weapons would swat down everything we have in not space, literally, because I don't believe in space for all the reasons I've discussed before, but all the things that are held up in the air. They would knock down all of those so-called satellites, and then they would do a cyber attack. While they're doing that, keep in mind, this is done in tandem, simultaneously. While they're doing that, they would do their cyber attack. They would shut down all of our military and civilian systems, all our telecom, TV, everything would be shut down. And the grid, because our grid is, guess what? Anything that's hooked up to the internet can be hacked. And our grid, being hooked up to the internet, can be hacked and shut off and kept off. If you thought that ransomware thing on the Colonial Pipeline was something, wait till you see what type of attacks the Chi-Coms would do, and maybe even the Russians along with them. They would do something even more powerful than that, and it would be everywhere, on everything. So the purpose of which would be to stop all ground-based communications like phones and things like that. With the satellites being knocked down, out of the upper Earth atmosphere below the firmament, you would have no more satellite-based anything. You would have no more phone. You would have no more internet. At least not within our borders, you wouldn't, because all of that would be shut off. You would have no electricity and no plumbing. And while all that's occurring, you'd have all these foreign Trojan shock armies coming off of their CCP regime properties and going immediately for their objectives, all of which would be close by. Just like in my stories, they would be done within a matter of days. The reason it would be done in days and not weeks, not months, is because they would already begin inside the country, within its borders. They're inside. They're in every corner of it. And they can immediately go for all their objectives, which would all be close by because their properties were purchased within a matter of short miles between their properties and their objectives, depending on the unit. You'd have multiple units going for their multiple different objectives because they would be broken up into their battalions, which their battalions would be broken up into companies, and they would be going for all kinds of key buildings. They would be going for all kinds of key infrastructure. They would be bum rushing these different installations. They would be cordoning entire cities. They would be sweeping areas for enemy activity. They would be basically shelling and carpet munitioning with their strategic heavy bombers and their ground attack planes, and the fighters would gain air superiority right off the bat. Anyways, when you would have your bases being bum rushed, there wouldn't be much you could do at that point either, because when your base is getting smashed through its fencing, it's not like our bases are forts. They're not like these monolithic forts that have actual fortifications. No, they're easy to get into. And the troops, when I was in the Army, guess what? We didn't walk around armed all the time. We had our weapons put up in weapons lockers in the basement of our building. And it took sometimes an hour or more for everybody to sign their weapon out. So when this surprise invasion comes, you're going to have a whole bunch of different military personnel unable to get to their weapons. And those that do are going to be severely outnumbered. They're not going to have working communications because Chinese and Russian electronic warfare are going to jam their radios. They're going to jam their radios. And I showed that too. Plus, the internet will be gone from the cyber attack. So will the grid. So will the telecom. And there won't be any satellite phone usage for our side because they'll knock all the satellites out, all the civil and military satellites. So there won't be anything that they could use. They're going to be confused. They're going to be badly confused. They're going to be badly staggered. They're not going to know where the hell the attack's coming from. They're not going to know anything. They're not going to see anything until it's too late. You're going to have artillery pounding everywhere. You're going to have drone strikes. You're going to have ground attack aircraft dropping their huge payloads. You're going to have even bigger strategic aircraft carpet munitioning whole cities and whole areas. You're going to have special forces elements running wild, doing all kinds of crazy missions, you're going to have a little bit of everything. You're going to have armored spearheads just smashing through these installations and, just driving into the heart of them and basically making it impossible for our forces to even get in their vehicles, much less even get to their weapons in time, because you're going to have these forces just breaking in like a shock force. It will be a shock. It'll be a literal shock to the senses because it'll happen so damn quick. There won't be any way to respond to it. Not effectively, at least. There won't be any effective response. Now, remember, my invasion work is all a best-case scenario, where I actually showed some mercy, and I let some of the troops get to their weapons and vehicles, but not very many. Not very many. I showed a little bit of mercy in my invasion work, but in real life, it wouldn't be like that. It would be much worse in that way. You would have a lot of men that wouldn't be able to get to their weapons. Not in time. It would just happen too quick. There would never be a draft in this country. Never would there be a draft. And the reason why is because, and I'm talking about in regards to us being invaded, there wouldn't be any time. How would there be time for one? If you read your Bible, there isn't any time for one because Jeremiah 50 and 51 talks about how fast this nation falls. It talks about the king, which should be our leader, right? It talks about the king getting constant reports of entire areas falling. Well, I showed aspects of that in my audiobook where the quote-unquote king, in his bunker in the presidential residence, he was getting reports of all the areas around the cap city that were falling. They were falling. I mean, they were smashing through defense line after defense line because all these foreign Chi-Com, Pakistani, Belarusian, and Russian forces were running amok. And the Cap City, they were able to throw up some defensive lines, but they all got smashed through quickly in a matter of a few days. I mean, they didn't have time really to hold out against anything. They had no time to do anything, and the amount of civilians they were able to mobilize was only on a local basis. It wasn't no nationwide thing. They could only do it when there were enough arms to even equip them with. When you have no ability to get weapons or equipment or logistics to arm up people to fight, you're not going to be able to have a draft. You're not going to be able to have anything. When you have foreign troops inside your country already, how are you going to do any of this stuff? Because that would disrupt everything. It would make it impossible. The only way something like that would occur would be on a very localized basis, and only if people could get to arms and equipment in time, like in my story in the Cap City, where they were able to get just enough rifles and body armor and things like that for a very small civilian force that was, they took a page from Kiev in 2022 when they were just handing out rifles and such to the citizenry. Well, they did sort of the same thing in my story in the Cap City battle. Toward the end, when they were getting really, really desperate, there was a naval warehouse with a lot of old equipment and weaponry in it, which is what they used to create this civilian fighting battalion with, and they all got slaughtered because they weren't trained or well versed in using their in battle tactics or using their equipment. They were just civilians that they gave weapons to, sort of like what happened in Kiev. A bunch of them got slaughtered over there too. So anytime you hastily try to arm and equip civilians to fight, you always run into a disaster. It's always a disaster, especially when they're not, tactically astute, when they're not trained in battle tactics. It takes time to raise up forces. It takes time to train a real army. You can't just bring an army up out of just handing people weapons and telling them to go fight. I mean, you can, and it's happened, but I'm saying it never works. It doesn't ever work. You have to train your troops in battle tactics and small unit tactics. You've got to train them in how to best use their equipment. You got to train them in cleaning it and maintaining it. How to fire on the move, how to, do different battle tactics, and how to cooperate with inter-unit cooperation and communication. You've got to organize them properly. You've got to coordinate their abilities properly insofar as how you use your different small units. It all has to work out. All the stars, proverbially speaking, have to align. And in my story, it didn't work out. They all got butchered. So I mean, they tried, but you get an A for effort, but it doesn't mean that it's actually gonna make a difference. It didn't make a difference. So I said all that to say this: that story is conveying very real facts, that all the invasion work is based on 100% fact. These are all facts. These are all real stats, real figures, real units, real equipment, real capabilities, real everything, real places. The only thing that wasn't real were the characters, because of course I had to make up characters. But they were based on extremely realistic people. They could be anybody. Those characters could literally be anybody, So I put a lot of work into those stories. I put a lot of psychological aspects into it. I mean, I made these people seem as real as they could possibly be. You got husband and wife dynamics with June and Jacob Robinson. You've got Sally, and you've got Joseph. You've got relationship dynamics even in the story. I mean, you've got all kinds of things in that story, and the people could all be very real people. Even the Chi-Com characters in the PLA, I made them into real people. I gave them, they weren't just this inhuman enemy. I mean, I made them seem like ordinary people that were just in the military, just like what I was when I was in the military. I was still a human being. I didn't lose my humanity. I mean, sure, I was in a bad conflict. Inadvertently, unwittingly doing things that maybe I shouldn't have been doing. But regardless, I was still a human being. Even though I was occupying a foreign country, I was the occupier. So that is what enabled me to be able to write such an accurate story, because I've already been in that role before. I understand what it is to occupy a foreign country. I was one of the occupiers. So people should realize that all my personal experience being blended with everything I've researched and everything I know about our foreign adversaries, everything that I blended together made a masterpiece of a story, or really plural, all the stories, because they're all entirely realistic. It's only realistic fiction, folks, until it's not. Until it's not. But for now, it can be considered realistic, but it's only realistic fiction until it's not. And what I mean by that is all the real things that are in those stories, it's all reality based, 100%. And all of those things will happen. They will happen. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. They will happen. And it's even according to what the word says, too. So I'm not in conflict with anything in the word. You know, it's biblically compliant, according to the word, and it's 100% reality based because I'm using real facts, figures, military units of our foreign enemies and even of our country. I mean, I'm using real everything, real equipment, real life experience from my own combat experience and my own, overseas experiences. Besides that, I blended everything into this to make these masterpieces. And I really, really hope people take them seriously and learn something from them, because there's a lot of things that can be gleaned and, learned from these stories and these map battles that show units from an overhead level view. I show what it looks like from an overhead view, like as if you're looking down at a city or a place. And I also show what it looks like on the ground from the nitty gritty, boots on the ground, street level view, as they say, a proverbial street level view. I show all of these different things. So I show every angle of it. I'm showing you all the angles of it. I even show you the enemy's point of view, which, like I said, I was able to do that pretty well based on my own experience. But I also show the partisan point of view, and that's because I understand what such a thing would be like, a counterinsurgency conflict. I mean, it was part of one. But I'm taking it and putting a different military against a different type of partisan element. But all the concepts are all based on my personal experience, blended with all the research I've done to make these masterpieces. So I really, really hope everybody takes that seriously. I haven't addressed the chat in a long time. I just got on a tangent, but let me see how everybody's doing here. Hey, Miriam, great to see you as always. And Wild Animus, you too. AK-47, welcome. You're a good dude. I need to make you a mod, AK-47. If you see anybody trolling, squash them. We stomp trolls in here. So I just gave you a wrench, man. See anybody trolling, making smart-ass comments, kick them out. Hey, all smiles. And Rage Against the Machine, welcome. Always good to see you too. And MB. Oh, hey, MB, I meant to make you a mod too. You've always been good, man. Here, you know what to do. You see anybody being a smartass or something or trolling, boot them out. I just gave you a wrench, MB. Yeah, and Brogan, always welcome. And Michael Sutton and Unorthodox and Point Fire and Welder Princess and yeah, Belton Road, Welder Princess, Belton Road. That's a very real way that the civil-military fusion policy of China is such an insidious thing, and that is a means by which that they get their tentacles into all these different countries where they can develop bases that are disguised. They're disguised as civilian areas, and they're really not. They really have a dual purpose. They can be used as a Chinese military outpost anytime. Same with the roads they build, the ports. The ports become logistical centers. The farms can become, if they're off a major highway, they can become a logistical center. I mean, you can put a bunch of barns on a property and you can put a bunch of fuel and munitions and, rifle ammunition, machine gun ammunition. You put all that stuff in a barn. I mean, you could stuff several barns full of all kinds of stuff. I mean, and all you need is a property adjacent to a major highway that will be used by the externals. I went on and on about the Trojans, because here's the thing about hybrid warfare that everybody needs to understand right now. Hybrid warfare, also called fourth generation warfare, is a blend of the Trojan horse shock armies, which are the key movers of the doctrine. They're the ones that really do all the heavy lifting. Whereas in Blitzkrieg, which is third generation warfare, you had front lines, but there's no front lines in fourth generation warfare. And the reason there's no front lines is because you have Trojans beginning in all sorts of different places. It's like mixing aspects of asymmetrical warfare with blitzkrieg, because you have all kinds of forces that begin behind the borders of the enemy country being invaded. So there are no front lines that way, because when the Trojans are already inside and in every corner of your land, there's no such thing as a front line because the enemy is everywhere. And then you have the external forces that come in from crossing the borders and beach landing or parachuting in if they're airborne units. Those are like the heavy-handed reinforcements. See, in the past, you would have a blitzkrieg war, which is third generation warfare. In the recent past, all wars have been blitzkrieg warfare, where you have a front line where troops basically come in across borders, and there's a front line. There's a line of contact where there's fighting, and it's a front line. But in fourth generation hybrid warfare, there are no such things as front lines, especially when you have all these CCP properties all over the nation that's to be invaded. They all begin in every corner of the land, and they all bum rush all their objectives, and they do it extremely fast. So when the external component, which in normal times, if you didn't have the Trojans, that would be your blitzkrieg component. They would be the ones that invade from outside. But now in fourth generation warfare, the external component takes a back seat to the Trojans. The Trojans are the main mover of the operation because they begin inside the enemy country already. So they're the ones doing all the heavy lifting, proverbially speaking. Then the externals, they act essentially they're nothing but the heavy-handed reinforcements who rush in deep inside the country. I mean, they're rushing, they're hauling ass. They only stop when they have to pull into a CCP property for more gas for their vehicles, or to reload up ammunition if they had to do they're essentially, as they're coming in, they're doing a massive drive-by type of thing. I mean, they don't really stop unless there's something in the way, but they continually drive in until these different group armies break off and split up as they get in really deep inland. Like, they start fanning out the deeper they get. But essentially what the externals do is they rush in as fast as they can and get in as deep as they can before fanning out to assist all the Trojan units who are already inside, already doing all the heavy lifting. They just act as a heavy-handed reinforcements, and that's your paratroopers, your airborne troops that parachute in, that's your heavy forces that drive in from across the borders, and your beach landers. I've shown all of this in my map battles. I showed exactly how it worked, and I've articulated as much also in my typed out stories and in my audiobook. I diligently go over how all these different operations work and how they come together. So essentially, in a nutshell, if I had to explain it, fourth generation warfare, also called hybrid warfare, is when you marry the concept of the Trojan horse married to blitzkrieg, which is also married to advanced technologies that haven't been used yet in warfare. We're talking about things like hypersonics, directed energy weapons. Hypersonics, they've been tested already, but I'm saying they would be widespread. They would see widespread use in hybrid warfare. You would have hypersonics blended with directed energy weapons and lasers and such, blended with robotics and AI, blended with brand new vehicles with all kinds of new capabilities, all kinds of aircraft, like 4.5, fifth generation aircraft coming in and gaining rapid air superiority and conducting massive ground attack operations in support of both the Trojans and your externals if they run into trouble as they're rapidly trying to move up the highways before they fan out to assist all the Trojans that are deep inland. So it's the marriage, essentially. Fourth generation warfare, or hybrid warfare, is the marriage between the Trojan horse concept, blitzkrieg, and high technology. So all of that combined essentially makes it what it is. Makes it extremely possible to knock down a nation of our size within a matter of days. In days. You really have to think about this. If we don't see it coming, Everybody's just out doing their regular everyday things. You don't see it coming. Our military doesn't see it coming because we lose all our communications at one time from the cyber attack and from the anti-satellite weapons like your S-500s of Russia or your FK-2000s of China. They swipe down all our satellites, and in rapid fashion, they do a cyber attack. They take out telecom. You just be walking down the street. Likely it'll start in the middle of the night, but here's what would happen. Just like in my stories, people were out doing their thing. The military was just, doing its thing. They had routine air patrols that all got shot down as soon as these massive waves of enemy forces crossed into the American airspace. You had all kinds of stuff that just popped out of nowhere. You saw how the characters woke up out of bed and they heard firing and noise and blasting, which woke them up to foreign troops invading their towns, their communities, where there were CCP properties that were breaking out and they were taking over just that quickly. It's that easy. People would be oblivious, and when all of a sudden they lose communications, or they might even be asleep. They might even be asleep when it begins. And then 2 hours into it, coinciding with the first main objectives of all the different battalions being captured, what you then seen was your Club Ks go into action. Now, if you listen to my audiobook or you read the stories or you listen to my map battles, I discuss how 2 hours into the start of the invasion, all the Club K systems fired for a matter of 10 hours. You had all these different systems popping up. They were all timed to fire at specific times. So for 10 straight hours in tandem with the air raids and air attacks that were constant, we're talking back and forth flights from bases to go back to reload, get their maintenance checks, and go back in on another sortie. There was steady air attacks combined with steady Club K missile attacks for 10 hours, 2 hours after the invasion began, until the next, 10 hours later. And then after that, by the end of the second day, really and truly by the end of the second day, most of the country had already fallen. And for the third and fourth day, all you really saw occurring on the third and fourth day was a massive mop-up operation. Because by that point, all of our forces that even made it to any type of weapons, or all the civilian forces that rose up and tried to fight back, like your reactionary civilians, most of which got slaughtered, but, because they didn't know how to fight. But, you might have military veterans that know a thing or two. And, like in the Broken Bow story, the people, they got organized quickly because they had a lot of veterans in their town that knew what they were doing, and they organized them, and they threw up the best defense they could just long enough to evacuate with a bunch of supplies to head into the foothills of the Ozarks where they could have survived, because winter was coming, and winter is always brutal if you have to live out in nature. So you had things like that happening. So by the third and fourth day across the land, you had that type of stuff occurring where you had armed civilians that maybe had some competent leadership trying to rush them out with all the supplies they could carry out into the forests or out into the deserts or mountains and caves and everything else so that they could set up their nomadic lifestyles and cache away all these different supplies so that they could survive through the winter, because otherwise a lot of people ended up starving and dying or getting sick because they lived out in nature and they weren't acclimated to it. They were not accustomed to camping or anything like that, so they died out due to the harsh conditions. But others who were tough enough became nomads or semi-nomadic, and those are the ones that did the best. Now, I would have been disingenuous if I would have said everybody can make it like that. Not everybody will survive, because you're going to have steady recon assets like Chinese drones and Chinese spy planes, Chinese satellites, who are monitoring everyone everywhere. I mean, there are going to be a little bit of gaps. They can't literally watch everything at one time, but they can definitely keep their eye on massive swathes of territory. So people are going to be getting caught left and right, but not everybody. It would take time for them to really, get everybody who ran out there. Like people that were in really small groups, those are the ones that had the easiest time hiding. But the bigger the group, see, there was advantage with numbers, but then again, there were disadvantages because the bigger the group, the more of a chance they had of being caught by somebody maybe letting a fire burn a little too bright, because you had to keep your fire down to about ember sizes, and underneath some pine trees or any other type of coniferous tree that would hide the IR signatures, from the recon assets. But every now and then you'd have people screwing up and making mistakes that would get their group caught and thereby annihilated. But people in smaller groups who were competent were usually the ones that did the best. But the larger groups, they had a little bit more advantage in terms of their numbers, which added to some of their defense capabilities. But all in all, they still got slaughtered in massive numbers at the beginning. So the lesson learned was that you want some sort of competent person at the helm, but you might also want to be in a small nomadic group where, there's noise discipline, where you have light discipline, because your lights can give you away, be that your fire burning too bright, or be it, flashlights or whatever else. That stuff will give you away to where recon assets will spot you in a flash, even if you're in the woods. So you have to keep things like that in mind. I put all kinds of things in my stories that people should have paid close attention to. Things that would help somebody truly have a capability to navigate a war. Truly. I mean, really and truly. These things are helpful bits of information. And if people don't understand that, then that's their problem. I mean, I can't make somebody understand anything, but people should at least want to try to. Now, in my shows and in my work, I try to break it down to where it's at a level that everybody can understand how this stuff works. I even made a community tab story review that people can go and watch. I mean, most of the videos in that review are pretty short, but they're jam-packed full of important information in the community tab story review. And it takes segments from my different typed out stories that I wrote, which go with the battle map videos, but at the time I wasn't live streaming, so I couldn't combine stories and maps together like I did with my civil conflict documentary, so I had to do them separate. But even so, I made that community tab story review that went over key parts of those stories that people should have paid attention to that have to do with personal survival and navigating a war. They're very important. Very, very important. So, let me see what everybody's saying. I might be a little interactive here now. See, there's a lot of things going on, and people have to really take the work on this channel seriously. I mean, I have if you take everything on this channel, it's like a university course in warfare, navigating it, surviving it. It's full of information that can help. And I don't know why more people don't see it. I guess it's because it's shadow banned and they don't like me because, there's probably Chi-Coms on the YouTube corporate board that are, making decisions like that. But all of that aside, I wish more people would still find the information, and that's why I'm going to leave this up as a floater channel. And the other thing I was going to say before I address the group is this. Lately, I've been thinking about, I made that Texas map, which was for my, my series, but I never did the battle maps of the Texas map. Like I never made the sub battle maps, because that would have taken a lot of time to do and a lot of effort. And I've been thinking, since I never really completed that, I might do that as its own separate documentary, which would keep me on YouTube longer, or I might just quit YouTube, but maybe one day come back just to do that and then leave again. I'm not really sure, but I've been really thinking about completing that because I do have the map, but I never did the sub battles, like the sub battle maps, like for the different cities or installations. I never did the battle maps that belong to the larger Texas map, where I break the Texas map down into its sub regions and show the battles that went on in each region. That would be something I might consider doing one day, but that would keep me on YouTube longer, and I don't know. It's just something I've been thinking about. Even if I quit YouTube, I might, come back just one more time and do that. I just don't know. It all depends on, I guess, how I feel about it, if I want to put the effort into it or not, But if I did something like that, it would be a massive project because there's a lot of battles that occurred in that central sector, because you had massive group armies plus Russian combined arms armies and some of their other allies who were operating in that part of the Southwest. We're talking Texas, New Mexico, Oklahoma. And that map I made of that area, there were multiple massive group armies, both external components, and your Russian combined arms armies too were externals, and plus you had Russian and Chinese armies as Trojans. So that would be a lot of work to make those battle maps, but that I may do that one day. I just have to think about it. I really have to think about that. But I'm definitely about done with my audiobook finally. I mean, I edited part 30, and then after part 30, all that's really left is the finale part that goes to the audiobook. And then after that, once all that's done and I've actually read it, then I'll go on to do my finale stream for myself personally, but that would be after I finish reading my story. I mean, the parts are already done and they're already ready. I mean, I just have to read them. I just have to get around to reading them. And, it takes a long time to read those. So I would really have to get myself, in a good mood for reading. And, things have to line up to where I would be basically ready to do that. So it'll be soon. I will read it soon, but not just yet. So, hey, C-Mac, great to see you. And let's see, all smiles. Great to see you, everybody. Rage Against the Machine. Yeah. Yep. And Unorthodox. Michael and Point Fire and NWO Nemesis and NWO Nemesis. I don't think they will, other than being like a springboard for the invasion itself. I mean, their cartels, though, they're like a proxy for China, because China cultivated a lot of those cartels in order to bring in their deadly chemical weapon. It's weapons-grade opioids, which are fentanyl. That's a weapons-grade opioid. I mean, I know that sounds crazy to call a drug a weapons-grade item, but that is a killer. That would kill a lot of people. Even like if you had I don't know, maybe like a pound of it, you could kill multiple cities with that. I mean, it's a very toxic, weaponized opioid. People that overdose on that, it's like they OD'd on morphine or other narcotics. I mean, it shuts down their breathing, it slows their heart rate, and they just fall asleep and never wake up. Now, even in the invasion, in my typed out stories, I featured that as something that they put into the sewer system to go after the partisans who were hiding down there in the Phoenix, in the second typed out story I wrote, which takes place in Phoenix, Arizona, where during the occupation, and it shows exactly how they would take over a city too. People's Armed Police and PLA units were taking over Phoenix, this massive city. I did that to convey an urban environment, like how Broken Bow was a rural environment. I made Phoenix to highlight an urban environment. That was the second story. Well, it shows how they took over Phoenix and then how the partisans hid in the sewer, but the Chi-Coms went after them by dumping those toxic chemicals down into the sewer in order to make them all fall asleep and never wake up. So, that's a very real threat, and the MSS of China, the Ministry of State Security, they've cultivated, that's like their intel agency like the CIA, plus secret police, all rolled together into one. Now, they've cultivated things like those cartels. Now, even those types of forces were in my second American Syrian-style civil conflict. They were called the La Raza narco state, and they took over territory in New Mexico and used it as a base of operations where they could produce their so-called products, I'll call them, and sell them, and also selling weapons. They were a faction, basically, of like narco militants, and they were also the ones who got the weapons for fanatical, secular humanist paramilitary death squads called the Jolly Roger Death Brigades. They armed and equipped them with the foreign weapons that came from Russia and China that were bought through the La Raza. So that faction, because they were their own faction. So yeah, definitely that's a threat, but I would say though that the nation itself of Mexico, no, I don't see them participating directly in it, but I see them acting as a springboard because I feel like China and Russia perhaps maybe threatened them, and that's why they're allowing the Chinese and Russians and their allies to base troops in Mexico, because I feel like Mexico got threatened by them, or maybe Mexico had debt that they owed China for Belt and Road type of modernization projects and couldn't pay it. So in order to pay it, they let the Chi-Coms and their buddies base troops there. I'm not really sure how it occurred, but I know it occurred. I know that they already have their forces there. So it either occurred out of a debt situation where they were indebted to China, or maybe China and Russia, or it was something like where they got threatened, or maybe it was a combination. It could have been a combination of all the above. There's no telling, but I know that they have their forces there, just like they do in Canada. So we are completely surrounded and infiltrated and subverted. So, I mean, that's just the way it is. It's been going on for literally decades now. Maybe even 1999. I know they acquired the Long Beach port in 2001, but they've bought other ports before that. I want to say in the very late 90s, or maybe even 2000, or because 2001 they got Long Beach. So for decades they've had forces here. Inside. They bought so much property in this country, it's insane. They're the biggest single property owner in this entire nation. So they have properties in every corner of it, all throughout it. So those become bases according to the Chinese CCP's civil-military fusion policy. And of course, China is going to let their allies. Of course, they're going to let their allies use their properties as bases. So everybody's going to be using the CCP properties. China predominantly, but also their allies will be there, like Russia, like Pakistan, North Korea, Belarus. All of them are stationed here on the Chinese Communist Party properties. So basically, in a nutshell, this is very critical information, and I hope everybody paid close attention to this and all the work on this channel, because it's all A1 work. I mean, this is like A1 stuff. I mean, nobody else is making detailed hypothetical scenarios with real information, real facts, real figures, real units, real equipment, real capabilities, real everything, real reactions, real psychology, real sociology. Nobody is making things like this but me. It would be cool if other people made things like this, but I feel like I'm the only one because I've not found anybody else making anything like I've made. So I'm going to leave it up as a university level course for people to really take in the material. So once I'm gone off of YouTube, this will be a floater channel to where people can take anything they want for themselves. And as long as it's used in its proper context, I really don't care. You can, copy the whole playlists of videos. If you want the whole audiobook, get the whole audiobook. If you want the whole, 96-hour invasion playlist, which is its own documentary, you can copy that. Or if you want the typed out stories, copy and paste them to your computer. I don't care, do what you got to do. You can take whatever you want. That's what this is for. All of this was done to help people, and I've never gotten a red cent for it. I've never asked for money. You've never seen me up here ask for money. In the years that I've been on YouTube, now 3 years, I've been on YouTube 3 years. I've never asked for 1 red cent, not a dime, not a dime. I don't do this for money. I do this when I think about how things are going to be when it comes home to roost. That makes me very concerned for other people. Believe it or not, for those of you who don't know me that well, I was a family man, and, I have a son, I was married a few times, but I care about other people because I know what it's like to have family. You have youngsters. You don't want your youngsters to grow up in a war, but it's going to be the reality. I can never, of course, give a specific date, but what I can tell you is exactly how it'll move, how it'll look, how it'll be, and why. I can show you all the hows and all the whys. All the hows and all the whys of what it'll be and why. So I think I've done that pretty well. I've articulated all this information extremely well. All my miscellaneous and Friday show playlists go over a lot of facts and figures throughout all those videos, a lot of them, ample facts and figures and capabilities and production numbers and everything else. I go over so much data on this channel that it's insane. And it's very well rounded in terms of the subject matter covered. You know, it's all relating to military stuff, of course, but I'm saying, you know, there's different aspects to it. There's the economic aspect, there's the financial aspect, there's the equipment aspect, there's the unit aspect, there's the capability aspect, there's the production number aspect, there's the, you know, just the whole gamut of different things. I mean, it's all on this channel, and it's all free to everybody. So, you know, it's all research and analytically based. You know, what I do is I research, I analyze information, I piece it all together to make a big picture, a coherent big picture. It's more coherent than anything anyone else will ever see because it's all 100% factually based. And if data changes, guess what? I always update everybody, don't I? I always come on here. If I find new data, I update everybody. You got updates from me, you know? Because data changes. It does. It changes. You know, sometimes, you know, a number of, you know, a certain type of equipment might change. You know, something might get retired. Something might get added. Something might have been lost in combat if it pertains to a conflict occurring. Something might have been sold. Something might have been put in long-term storage. Something might be whatever. You know, whatever. I cover it all here. And if things change, I tell people. You know, there's things that get produced that adds to numbers, you know. Numbers change. So I've been updating people, and it's been constant. So this channel covers a wide array of subject matter related to the world military affairs. You know, I mean, that's what this is. I stay in my area of expertise in terms of the research, in terms of my personal experience, in terms of how I piece together information. I stay within my area that I'm comfortable with, that I have some expertise in. And I do. I have expertise. You know, I don't have to have some piece of paper that tells me what I know. I know what I know, and I know what I do. I'm even a writer. I write stories. I write scenario scripts. You know, after I got out of the military, I aspired to be a writer. I did. I aspired to be a writer. So these stories I've written, whether they're the typed out ones or this audio book or the story that begins the civil conflict docuseries or the scenario scripts for the map battles for the invasion work, you know, that's all out of my aspiration to become a writer, to create, you know, and I've created some very realistic, very creative scenarios. They're only hypothetical until they're not. Remember those words. Remember those words well. They're only hypothetical scenarios until they're not. Always keep that in mind at all times. Those characters in those stories, they could be anybody. They could be you. You know, think about it. Really think about that. Put yourself in their shoes. Imagine yourself in those moments. So, hey, Patty and Juan Minoz and everybody that came in, thank you. Exactly, AK-47. They're already here. They've been here for years now, for over 2 decades. They're here, and they're surrounding the country as basically, you know, external component forces for their Trojan forces that are already inside. The externals are the ones that are surrounding our country, that are going to race deep inland to aid all the Trojans that are doing the heavy lifting when the war begins. After they've knocked our satellites down and gave us a cyber attack from hell that basically disables everything we've got, you know, between the tandem blow of the cyber and anti-satellite weapons, then the electronic warfare assets that'll shut off any radio communications or anything else. You know, electronics, you know, I've already explained how electromagnetic, tongue twister there. Electromagnetic frequencies used by certain electronic warfare jamming systems can not only get into Faraday cages and shut off equipment, but, you know, they're very real and they're in use already. You know, there's jamming pods that the Chi-Coms and Russians have, or antennas even, that can do multiple tasks insofar as electronic warfare operations are concerned. So that's very real. And, the Donald Cook getting shut off 2 different times in the same place, the Black Sea, back in 2014 and early 2021, that happened, just like the 2 F-35s that the Pentagon's embarrassed about that flew within the range of the CHICOM electronic warfare assets that are stationed at Mumian Island, one of their reef bases down there in the South China Sea. They strayed within range of it, and both of them almost crashed into the sea. They lost control of their aircraft temporarily until they got back out of the field that was being generated. So, yeah, the Pentagon didn't want to talk about that. I have the video of that archived somewhere in one of my other playlists. One of my playlists that isn't my stuff. I made other playlists for other pertinent videos that I've seen important to keep. So that's in there. That's archived in there along with the Donald Cook videos, everything. Our enemies have this stuff. They're far advanced in terms of their technology, both China and even Russia, too. So underestimating either one of them, especially China, who's the world superpower in basically every category that even matters, technologically, and their numbers, their industrial might. They're the most industrialized nation on the face of the earth, with 40% of the whole world's industrial base. Included in that is their ginormous military-industrial complex. China should never, ever be underestimated by anybody. It's a fool's errand to underestimate China. For anybody, even professional people, for them to say something against China, like basically trying to disregard them, that's a stupid thing to do when that's a nation that can literally take over the entire world. They absolutely could. Because all you had to do for that is not only their nearly 30 million men under arms and all their high technology, but you give them some years, give them about 10 years, and they can build up an army of even more multiple tens of millions, that could just overrun the world. They have the industrial base paired with the population. Demographically, they can do it. Demographically, there's enough men that they could make literally a several hundred million man army. Several hundred million man army. Because they've got roughly 350 million men that are of military age in China. That's not even counting the women. They're in that same age bracket. That's just the men. So all in all, combining the men and women, it's about 650, maybe 670 in terms of like the combined age bracket of the men and women together. But of just the men, they have about 350 million men that are military age. And if you did a 40 to 50-year-old range, you would add another roughly 200 million to that. I mean, just think about it. But those would probably be like your factory workers that stay in China cranking out tanks and planes and rifles and machine guns and mortars and rocket artillery, howitzers, all of it, shells. I mean, all kinds of aircraft. China produces the most aluminum in the world. They have the largest capacity to produce fighters and ground attack planes. They already have the biggest combat air fleet, especially due to the number of fighters and ground attack planes. They're even using old fighters and converting them into Kamikazee-drones. Kamikazee-drones. They have thousands of old aircraft that they're converting to Kamikazee-drones. That would just overwhelm anybody. So China should never, ever be underestimated by anybody. They're the single most powerful nation in the world. They just don't tend to flaunt it, even though that they, their leader shows arrogance because he rules the most powerful nation in the world. China doesn't go around boasting like we do. China doesn't have to boast. It's sort of like what a rapper once said. He said, real gangsta ass, what's, don't have to flaunt them because real gangsta ass, what's, know they got them, China knows what it has. It doesn't have to go around bragging that they're this and that. Even though Xi shows his arrogance, they don't have to brag that they're this and that. They already know they're the most powerful nation in the world, and they know why. So anybody that thinks, China, they think less of China, they're horribly mistaken. I'm not talking China up. I'm not talking them up at all. I'm just telling the truth about them because I see what they have. I see exactly what they have, and it's dangerous. It's dangerous. It's a threat. It's a threat to our entire existence, really. Even the word, the Bible talks about a 200 million man army. There's only one nation that could arm and equip an army like that, and that's China, because of all the industry they have to go with it, with the numbers, with their numbers. So keep that in mind at all times. Yes, it could take them time to build an army like that, but it wouldn't take them that long, maybe just some years, but they could do it. They sure as hell could do it. They already have a lot of howitzers in long-term storage. They could equip brand new artillery units with everything they have in long-term storage. They've got more vehicles in long-term storage. They have an immense amount of trucks, hundreds of thousands of trucks. They've got all kinds of things. Because they already have almost a 30 million man force under arms between their paramilitary, which is gigantic, and their massive army, their regular army, and their air force, their navy, their strategic missile forces. They have the world's single biggest ground-based strategic missile forces anyway. That's not just their nukes, it's other conventionally armed cruise missiles that are armed with conventional munitions, and of course their ballistic missiles that are armed with conventional munitions. They have the single biggest ground-based missile forces in the world, and that's a fact. And that bleeds over into their Navy and Air Force. They also have the most naval and air missiles too. Cruise missiles and otherwise. Even though most are conventionally armed, it doesn't matter. They still have the biggest missile forces because they can manufacture more of everything than anybody can. And they've even, now that they have all these new factories for the past 6 years, started their helicopter output, and they're putting out helicopters like it's nobody's business now. We're talking, a few hundred a year now being manufactured. That's a lot. But they're manufacturing a whole lot of other things too in massive quantities. So never underestimate the most powerful nation in the world. They don't have to brag about it because they know what they got. America is nominally this and that, but America in reality is not this and that because we've lost our power. We're not what we once used to be. And people still haven't figured that out yet. We can't do anything anymore. We're incredibly weak now. That's why I warn about the Eastern elites and their diabolical plans for us. They have designs on us. That's what people don't understand. While these Western elite asshats tear apart their own power base, the Chinese and Russians are looking at them and being like, these guys are morons. We're just going to go stomping in there and take everything that they have. And that's exactly what they're going to do. That's what the word says is going to happen too. And that's what reality looks like. So I'm going to get going here. I've been yapping along for a minute, but this has been a serious stream, sort of like the last one. But I'll be reading my story parts coming up here pretty soon, so that'll probably be over the weekend or maybe Monday after that or Tuesday. I'll read part 30 and then the finale part. So everybody have a blessed